Happy New Year to our old friends. Welcome back to our new friends. Welcome. Welcome to Consumer Action's first webinar of 2022. Now, I'm not trying to brag this morning, but you are in for a real treat today. My name is Linda Williams. I am a community outreach and training manager with Consumer Action. And on behalf of the entire staff at Consumer Action, I would like to welcome you. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel good about the conversation we get to have today on kitchen table economics, dealing with debt and debt collection. In every city and small town across the U.S., the kitchen table is where many households gather to conduct their financial dealings. It is where most families come to terms with bills and income, whether there's enough income, money to pay the bills and make it over to the next month. And when there's not enough money to cover basic living expenses and pay all of the bills, families are faced with the complex financial decision which bill to go unpaid first. And as advocates, we all know what happens when families fall behind on debt. The debt collectors start circling, they start calling, and these calls only add stress to an already difficult situation, especially when the calls involve harassment, threats, and intimidation. And most consumers that we deal with, they don't know what to do when collectors call and now call and call and call. So let's discuss. With us today is April Kunoff. April is a subject matter expert on debt collection and a staff attorney with the National Consumer Law Center. Didn't I tell you you're in for a treat today? She will lead a discussion on the Federal Fair Debt Collection Practice Act and the new CFPB regulations that amend the act, and she will explain how these new rules will impact consumer going forward. Also joining us is Vicky Elisa. She is a community educator and trainer with the Women's Institute for a Secure Retirement. Vicky will discuss what consumers can do when there are more bills than money. Okay, so sit back and buckle up because we're bringing the fire today. Now, before I get too excited, I need to go over a few housekeeping items. As the announcer stated, you are in listen only mode, but you can use the question function on the right of your screen to type in questions. We love hearing from you. So at the end of the presentations, Outreach Trainer Nelson Santiago, he's going to facilitate the question and answer segment. This is where we want to hear from you. So please take a minute, find that function so you can send Nelson a ton of questions. Now, this is a 90-minute webinar. Yes, 90-minute webinar, and it is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording and the PowerPoint slides used today, along with a few handouts, no later than tomorrow afternoon. At the end of the training, you will receive a survey about today's webinar, and you will get that survey before you sign up. So we need you to complete that survey. We value your feedback as we work diligently to improve our service to you. So if you have a comment, a suggestion, or even a compliment, we'd love to hear from you, so please complete the survey. You will also receive a certificate of completion for attending today's webinar. And if you're an AFC professional, you will earn 1.5 CEUs for attending today. So how about that? Now, before I go any further, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor and update you on what's happening at Consumer Action. This webinar is presented as part of Consumer Action's COVID-19 educational project with funding by Chase. So a very special thanks to Chase for the opportunity to reach so many of you here today. So for those of you who are new to Consumer Action, if you're wondering, what do we do at Consumer Action? Well, as it states on the screen, through education and advocacy, we fight for strong consumer rights and policies that promote fairness for all consumers, but especially for underrepresented communities nationwide. At Consumer Action, we are proud of all of our work, but we are especially proud of our COVID-19 educational project. So when you're on our website, click on that middle link, that little reddish looking bar, and you will land on our COVID-19 project page. There you will find resources that you can share with your client communities that will help them navigate this COVID-19 financial crisis. You click on the word webinar and you will land on our YouTube channel. And if you can subscribe while you're there for free. And there you can review some of our past and most popular webinars, some that has received over 2 million views. Click on fact sheets and you will find a variety of topics that you can download and share with your clients. We have fact sheets on identity theft and account fraud during COVID, which is running rampant, on fair housing, which is a huge issue now, estate planning, financial help for undocumented workers, just to name a few. So check it out. Go to www.consumeraction.org/COVID-19 to learn more. The address is there at the bottom of the screen. Now, let me review the agenda with you so you'll know where we are headed today. At Consumer Action, we believe in making learning fun. So we open up each and every trainer, regardless of whether it's virtual or in person, by testing your knowledge on the topic of the day with our most popular game, How Much Do You Know? So today we have 4 true or false questions. All are related to today's discussion on dealing with debt and debt collection. Following the game, I will introduce you to our guest professionals in the order they will be presenting. Nelson Santiago will follow, and I will come back and I will tell you how to donate to Consumer Action. So now, in the spirit of the upcoming Olympic, let the game begin. This is how the game is played. We have 4 questions. All are true or false. I will read each question and you will use the poll function to answer each question. Once the poll is closed, we will take a look at the results and then you will learn if the statement is true or false. And at the end of the game, wait for it, the person with the most correct answers, they get to walk away with the bragging rights to How Much You Know game. So are you ready? Let's roll out the first question. Federal law Federal law requires collectors to stop calling if a consumer says stop calling during a call with the collector. Wait a minute. Is that true or false? Go back to the first question. Federal law prohibits collectors from collecting any time barred debt after the statute of limitation has expired. Is that true or false? Okay, a couple more seconds. Okay, let's close the polls and take a look at the results. 61% thinks it's true. 39% says it's false. I don't know. Let's ask the expert. April, is it true or false that federal law prohibits collectors from collecting any time barred debt after the statute of limitations, whatever that is, has expired?
So unfortunately, this is false. The rules, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, do prohibit filing a lawsuit on a debt after the statute of limitations has expired or threatening to sue, but it doesn't prohibit the debt collector from calling or sending letters or otherwise trying to contact the consumer to get the consumer to pay on that time barred or sometimes called zombie debts.
Great. Thank you, April. You're doing great. So let's move on to question number 2. Okay, now I have the right question. Federal law requires collectors to stop calling if a collector says stop calling during a call with the collector. Is that true? Is that false? Federal law requires collectors to stop calling if a consumer says stop calling me during a call with the collector. Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. Couple more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the results. 51% thinks it's true, 49% says it's false. Well, let's ask the expert. April, is it true or false that federal law requires collectors to stop calling if a consumer says stop?
So the good news here is this is true. Under the new regulations, the CFPB has clarified that even if the consumer just asks over the phone without putting a request in writing, the debt collector has to stop if the consumer says stop calling.
Great. Thank you, April. You're doing great. We only have 2 more questions. Hang in there. Just 2 more questions. Okay, let's roll out question number 3. Creating a budget and sticking to it can help you better manage and reduce debt. Wait, what? Creating a budget and sticking to it can help you better manage and reduce your debt. Is that true or is that false? Sticking to a budget, is that true or is that false? Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the result. 99% of you think that's true and only 1% thinks it's false. Well, let's ask the expert. Vicky, can you tell us whether creating a budget and sticking to it can help us manage and reduce debt?
It is absolutely true. In order for you to know where you're going, you need to have a plan, and that budget is your plan. And sticking to it can help you better manage and reduce that debt.
Great. Thank you, Vicky. Okay, one last question. One last question. Let's roll out the final question, please. My debt would eventually drop off my credit report and it won't hurt me financially. Say what? Let me read this again. My debt would eventually drop off my credit report and it won't hurt me financially? Come on now. Is that true or is that false? Okay, let's close the poll. Take a look at the results. 14% thinks it's true, 86% says it's false. Okay, Vicky, tell us.
Even
Is
though
it
that debt at some point is going to go away, it will still hurt you financially, especially if you're trying to secure a home or if you're trying to get an automobile. Those types of things are going to impact you financially.
great? Okay. Thank you, Vicky, and thank you, audience, for playing the game. I hope you enjoyed the game. Now, are you ready to discuss dealing with debt and debt collection? Of course you are. Okay, let me introduce you to our first speaker. Our first speaker is April Kunoff. She is a staff attorney in the National Consumer Law Center's Boston office, where she advocates for fair debt collection. She is the co author of the NCLC's Fair Debt Collection and a contributing author to Surviving Debt. And I think they have a new booklet that just came out last month. Prior to joining NCLC, April was an associate at Shapiro, Haber, and Ermy, LLP, a law clerk for the Honorable Justice Gary Katzman at Massachusetts Appeals Court, and a public interest fellow at the Cambridge and Somerville Legal Services Office of Greater Boston Legal Services. Welcome to the webinar, April. We are honored, I mean, absolutely honored to have you with us today. Our next guest speaker is Vicky Elisa. She is a financial literacy educator for Mothers Voices Georgia, Inc. and Wiser. As an award winning producer, Vicky has taken her economic survival and empowerment message to Ghana, Nigeria, and across the United States, reaching millions of women with how to secure a healthy retirement. She is a Red Book Magazine Hero Award winner, and she worked on former First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign for DeKalb, Georgia. She was Georgia's TV producer for What Every Woman Needs to Know About Retirement, which was hosted by former First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton. Then I tell you, you're in for a treat today. She is a wiser woman vision leader, a White House delegate on Social Security and retirement, and she has appeared in Forbes, New York Times, Chicago Sun-Times, NRP News, ABC News, NBC News, Red Book Magazine, CNN, and C-SPAN, and now on Consumer Action's YouTube channel. Welcome back, Vicky. We are honored to have you today. So now, without further ado, let me turn this presentation over to April Kunoff so she can tell us about those new CFPB rules. Okay, April, I'm giving you control. You have control.
Okay, I think, yep, all set. Thank you so much for that introduction, Linda, and I am really excited to talk to everyone today a little bit more about consumer rights and the new debt collection regulations. So, oops, do I have it? Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. Before we go into what these new regulations say and an overview of consumer rights, I want to first stop really quickly and talk about why we're talking about debt in America. What we know is before the pandemic, there were 68 million Americans with debt and collection on their credit reports. And as recently as 2021, the end of 2021, there were 77.6 million consumers. So this is a huge problem affecting tens of millions of Americans, and it's a growing problem in this country. What we also know here, citing some statistics from the Urban Institute, is this is also a racial justice issue, and there are racial disparities in terms of the distribution of who has debts and collection. And that disparity at the national level looks like 24% of the population in predominantly white communities with debts and collection compared to 39% in predominantly communities of color around the country. So big shout out to the Urban Institute for a really great tool here if you're looking for more details about debt and collection in your state or county. Before we dive into the specific details, I want to level set for a minute to make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about the CFPB. We're talking about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, a federal agency created under the Dodd-Frank Act and designed to protect consumers from financial harm. This agency oversees the Federal Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, which is the basic federal law that protects consumers with debts in collection. And this law sets a floor for consumer protections around the country. States can have more stringent protections, but this is the minimum level of protection. When we talk about the FDCPA and the regulations today, and we talk about debt collectors, there's a very special definition under the Act, and that definition covers third-party debt collectors, your collection agencies, debt collection attorneys, debt buyers, but it doesn't cover original creditors like banks who are collecting their own debts in their own names. And also when we're talking about these debt collection rights, we're talking about consumer debts. So if you're working with clients who have business debts, those aren't covered by the FDCPA, but they might be covered by state or other protections in your area. And the other term that I want to make sure everybody's familiar with is Regulation F, or Reg F, as I might call it. These are the debt collection rules that the CFPB just enacted, and so they just took effect at the very end of November in 2021. And so these are the new regulations under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. Okay, so we're going to dive right in to talk about consumer rights and debt collection, and we're going to start with debt collection communications, which was a major area of focus for these regulations. I want to, before I move on to the content, give a shout out to the Debt Collection Lab for some of the artwork that I'm displaying in this presentation. And this group based out of Princeton has really helpful statistics about debt collection lawsuits that have been filed in different parts of the country. So definitely check out the Debt Collection Lab if you're looking for more information about debt collection lawsuits. Okay, first up, talking about communication. We're going to talk about phone calls. So the regulations say they create a baseline that debt collectors can attempt to call consumers up to 7 times in 7-day period. And that limit is per debt and collection. So that means that if a consumer has multiple accounts that are in collection with that debt collector, the debt collector would be able to call multiples of 7. So let's say the collector is collecting 3 medical debts for the consumer. That means that the debt collector in that 7-day period would be able to call the consumer up to 21 times per 7 days in that period. So the one thing that's a little bit different is student loans. If all of those loans are serviced under one account number, they would be treated as a single account and collection. But otherwise, every single account and collection is going to have its own 7 attempts. Now, if the debt collector actually speaks to the consumer, there's a kind of cooling off or buffer period here where the debt collector would not be able to call back for 7 days. But again, that is per account in collection. So, what this means in practice is for individuals who have multiple accounts in collection, this 7 attempts can add up really quickly and be pretty overwhelming. And a couple of things to know about these regulations is that the 7 attempts is a presumption. There are some reasons that debt collectors might be able to call more or call less. And so there's a lot more details in the regulations if you're interested in that. And there's also some calls, like if the call doesn't connect or gets a busy signal, those wouldn't count toward the 7 attempts. The other thing to know here is that the 7 attempts in 7 days, it also applies to third parties. So if the debt collector is calling your friend to try to find out your location information, they would have the same limit for those calls to third parties as well. Okay, so I'm going to move on from phone calls to talk about limited content messages. So this is totally new content in the regulations. And the idea here is that there's a new definition for what is a limited content message. And it has to be a voicemail message, and it has to be for a consumer. And the regulations have a list of specific content that has to be included. And then there's also a list of optional content that can be included. And what I've done here is I have some examples. The first example, this is Robin Smith calling from ABC Incorporated. Please contact me or Jim Johnson at 1-800-555-1212. That's the really basic, only the required information, while the longer example below has both the required and the optional information. If you're working with clients and they're getting these kind of voicemail messages, this is probably a debt collector leaving a voicemail message for the consumer. So why did the CFPB create these rules around voicemail messages? Well, a couple of things. The CFPB says that these rules for limited content messages can avoid some of the particular requirements that debt collectors usually have to comply with under the FDCPA. So the debt collector, if they're leaving one of these limited content messages, they don't have to make the normal disclosure. This communication is from a debt collector and its attempt to collect a debt. Any information will be used for that purpose. So you noticed in those examples we just showed you that was not part of that message. And also what the CFPB has said is that if a third party overhears that voicemail message and not just the intended recipient, that's not a third party disclosure. And they've also said that anyone who complies with these rules has meaningfully disclosed the caller identity. So, for the debt collectors, this is a way to be able to leave voicemail messages and be clearer as to what the rules are for those voicemail messages. It may be that we start seeing a lot more clients getting voicemail messages from debt collectors. Now, these voicemail messages do count to this 7 call and 7 day per debt and collection limit. And that's also true for new technology that we see being used more called ringless voicemails. So with a ringless voicemail, the phone doesn't ring at all, but the debt collector is able to leave a voicemail for the consumer. So moving on from calls and voicemail messages, I want to just talk generally about electronic communications. So unlike phone calls, the CFPB doesn't say there's a limit of this many emails per week or this many text messages per week. Instead, they say if you send too many communications of any type, whether it's too many emails or too many phone calls or too many text messages, that can be harassing or oppressive or abusive. But it doesn't specify how many is too many. It does say that it can be a combination of different types of communication. So it can be a combination of emails and phone calls and text messages that all add up to being harassing or oppressive conduct. And so, consumers who are getting too many messages may have a claim against the debt collector for a violation of Regulation F and the FDCPA. The regs also specify that the same presumption about when is a convenient time for debt collectors to contact consumers, those same presumptions that apply to phone calls also apply to electronic communications. That means that the debt collector can send emails between 8 a.m. and 9 p.m. And that does not mean that if the consumer looks at that email message at 11 p.m., the debt collector has violated the rules. It's about when the debt collector actually sends the message. And the whole system with electronic communications and debt collectors under Regulation F is set out as an opt-out system and not an opt-in system. So I'm going to take a minute and say what I mean by that. So debt collectors are able to email or text or otherwise electronically communicate with consumers without the consumer's specific consent to that type of electronic communication. The debt collector is required to include instructions about how to opt out, and the consumer can opt out of those messages, but they don't have to first get permission, so they don't first have to get opt-in from the consumer. So one question that comes up is, okay, if the debt collector is going to use these electronic communications, how should the debt collector be getting the email address, for example? And what the CFPB does here is creates some optional procedures. These procedures are really complicated, and I'm not going to go into great detail about them, but basically there's three buckets. One procedure involves consumer obtaining the email address from the consumer. One involves obtaining the email address from the creditor, and one involves obtaining the email address from a prior debt collector. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the creditor prong of getting the email address, because one of the steps under that prong is that the creditor actually sends a letter or an electronic message to the consumer, which we're going to call a goodbye letter, that basically says, we're going to transfer this account to a debt collector, and we're going to provide this email address. And so the letter has to say which debt collector, and the letter also has to say which email address they're going to give to the debt collector. And then the important thing here is this notice to the consumer also has to include instructions about how to opt out. So the consumer can say, actually, creditor, please don't send this email address to the debt collector. And then the debt collector would not be able to use that further. So what you might see or start seeing with your clients, especially if you're working with them while the accounts are still with the creditor, is you might start to see language like this sample language in letters from the creditor. The regulations also talk about work emails in particular. So the collector can't knowingly use an email address that is provided by a consumer's employer. There are, as we were just talking, there's some specific procedures related to that for email addresses obtained from creditors. But in general, the rule is you can't knowingly use it unless the consumer either used that work email address to contact the debt collector or otherwise gave consent, or there was another safe harbor procedure from prior collector. So I think the important thing here for people working with consumers is that if you're working with the consumer, you want to caution them against using an email address from work to correspond with a debt collector. Even if they want to correspond electronically, the debt collector would then be able to respond to that work email address. And, certainly in many workplaces, there's no confidentiality for that information when you're using workplace email. So just like emails, we have also the question of which phone numbers can debt collectors use to send text messages. And there are fewer buckets here in terms of ways to get a phone number to use to send text messages. Here, the CFPB, again, sorry, these are optional procedures, but if the debt collector does want to follow them, they have to obtain consent from the consumer, and they either have to have gotten that consent less than 60 days ago, or they have to verify that the phone number was not reassigned, because one thing that's different about text messages is that you may be texting a phone number that's been reassigned to somebody else. And so then the personal information of the consumer could be shared with a third party. There's been a lot of attention about social media and debt collection. So I want to walk through what the rules say here about social media. First, the rules make really clear that debt collectors cannot post or comment in a way that's going to be either viewable to the general public or that is going to be viewable to the consumer's social media contacts. They can send, however, direct messages to the consumer. So debt collectors can directly message people via social media and something like Facebook Messenger. They can use that in order to try to reach the consumer. Debt collectors can also send a request to join the consumer's social media network. Now, in both cases, whether they're sending a direct message or seeking to join the consumer's social media network, they have to disclose that they're a debt collector. And also when communicating via direct message, like all other electronic messages, they have to include an opt-out mechanism. So, I think that clearly we want to discourage people from letting debt collectors join private networks and see information that you might share with your friends, but that you don't make publicly available to the general population. And so certainly it's always a good idea to not just accept every request that you might receive to join your social media network, and to be cautious about that. There are also ways in which debt collectors can use direct messages to obtain location information from third parties. So that's something that could happen as well. And there they would not be able to disclose that they're a debt collector. They're just trying to contact someone to get location information for the actual consumer. So I'm going to end this section on communications by talking about 4 ways to stop communications from debt collectors. So if you're familiar with the original Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, you'll know that consumers have always had the ability under the federal law to stop all communications from debt collectors. And they do this by sending a written notice to the debt collector and saying, stop contacting me, don't contact me anymore. And what the regulations do is that they specify that this notice can be sent electronically as long as, just a little caveat here, as long as the debt collector accepts electronic communications from consumers. So what does that mean? If the debt collector says, you can email me here, then the consumer can use that email address to send a cease contact notice to that debt collector. And that will stop almost all communications. There are a few exceptions involving things like plans to file lawsuits against consumers. Now, the next one on this list goes back to our game at the start, which is the ability to turn off a particular type of communication. So as we talked about, a consumer can call a debt collector or say on a phone call with a debt collector, stop contacting me, stop calling me, sorry, or more specifically, stop calling me at this phone number, or stop emailing me, or stop texting me. And the debt collector has to comply with those requests. The difference here is that it's not a general stop of all communication, but just puts a stop to the particular type of communication, whether it's all phone calls or calls to a particular number or emails to a particular address or all emails. And the consumer can put this in writing, but it can also be done orally, such as over the phone. As we already talked about, electronic communications have to include a reasonable and simple method to opt out. When we look at that, because of the prevalence of scammers and people pretending to be debt collectors, we want to really caution consumers to not click on links or download things or just to kind of be conscientious. But if the email says reply and stop, if you want to stop electronic communications, those are methods that the consumer can also use to stop that actual communication. And finally, we mentioned this earlier, but that one creditor goodbye letter, if the consumer is getting that goodbye letter, the consumer can stop that email communication before it starts by specifying, please don't contact me. By saying to the creditor, please don't share my email address with this debt collector. Okay, so our next section is we're going to talk about what Regulation F says about credit reporting. So Regulation F has a new provision about passive debt collection, is the term the CFPB uses, and we call it parking. So what is parking? Parking is what happens when a debt collector would report an account to a credit bureau before telling the consumer or without telling the consumer about the alleged debt. So perhaps there was an alleged debt of $50 to a medical provider. The debt collector might decide that trying to pursue that debt didn't make financial sense, so it would just directly report to the credit bureau and basically sit back and wait for the consumer to need credit to buy a house, to buy a car, to get a job, to get an apartment. And at that time, the consumer was usually had limited options due to time pressures in terms of disputing that debt, and would typically just pay off the account rather than trying to get to the bottom of whether that amount was really owed. So what the CFPB has done to try to prevent that practice is they're now requiring debt collectors before reporting to a credit bureau to either actually speak to the consumer in person or by phone about the alleged debt, or to send something in writing or by electronic communication to the consumer. And if they send something, then they have to wait 14 days, and then they have to monitor for non-delivery. So that means they have to wait and see if the letter is returned or if something bounces in an email. And if they're not successful and they do get the letter back or the email does bounce, they'd have to attempt again before they'd be able to actually report to the credit bureau. Now, what's important to note here is they have to notify the consumer about the alleged debt. They do not have to notify the consumer that they intend to credit report this alleged debt. So the standard notice provisions that they would use otherwise are still fine. And here there is an exception. There is no reporting requirement, or excuse me, there's no notice requirement if there's reporting to a specialty credit reporting for check writing history. Okay. Time-bar debt collection. So this is, again, another issue that we talked about up top. The regulations do talk about time-bar debt collection. And I want to spend a minute just making sure we're all on the same page about what time-bar debt is. So statutes of limitations are prescribed by state law, and the states might say you have 3 years to bring a claim on a contract dispute, or you have 6 years to bring a claim, for example. And after that period of time, so 4 years in the first example or 7 years in the second, if the creditor brought a lawsuit after that period of time had passed, then the consumer would have a defense to that collection lawsuit and could say, no, this is, there's a statute of limitations violation here. Now, once the statute of limitations has run, that debt is time barred, meaning that the statute of limitations has expired. And the debt collector, under these regulations, the CFPB has clarified that debt collectors are prohibited from bringing a lawsuit on that time-barred debt, or also threatening to bring a lawsuit, threatening the consumer, if you don't pay, we're going to sue you. And these rules don't apply for proofs of claim that get filed in bankruptcy, but we're talking about lawsuits that get filed in state court for debt collection lawsuits. But what's important to clarify here, and which what we talked about at the top, is that prohibiting lawsuits and threats of lawsuit is not the same thing as prohibiting all attempts to collect these time-barred debts. So the rules do not prohibit debt collectors from emailing, from calling, or otherwise attempting out-of-court collection. Now, the rules do prohibit false or deceptive or unfair practices in collecting. So if the debt collector is using otherwise deceptive practices in collecting or attempting to collect this time-barred debt, there may still be a violation, but there's no general prohibition against the collection of all expired time-barred debt. Okay, and so our last section here, we want to talk about validation notices. And these are the notices that go out with information about the alleged debt and about the consumer's rights under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. So the first thing we want to talk about is methods of providing notice. And what the regulation lays out is that the debt collector can contact the consumer either in writing or electronically in the initial communication or within 5 days of the initial communication. In addition, the regulation says that the debt collector can contact the consumer orally in the initial communication. That means that the debt collector could call up the consumer and over the phone provide all of the information that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So in most cases, we anticipate that the debt collector is going to either provide the information in writing or electronically. And if it does one of these two things, it has to send the information in a manner reasonably expected to provide actual notice and in a way that can be kept and accessed later. And then there's additional rules if the information is sent electronically. And here with the electronic information, the CFPB has said that debt collectors can send all of the information we're going to talk about in a few minutes electronically to the consumer in an initial email. So this means that without having spoken over the phone or exchanged emails or sent anything in the mail, the debt collector could send to your email address a list of all the information about the debt and your rights. Now we have a lot of concern here because the consumer won't know this is coming. They won't have heard of this debt collector. They won't be on the lookout for this email. And there's also concerns about this being the wrong email address, being an email address that isn't checked frequently, or even being something that goes to spam. So lots of concerns here, but that's what the rule says. And then if it's not sent in the initial communication, the debt collector would have to comply with additional rules to get the consumer's consent in order to send that electronically. Okay, this is a long list of some of the information about the debt that has to be in. We're talking about now about what information actually has to be included in the validation notice. So this information is significantly more than what is required under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. So Regulation F does expand on that list of information in the statute. In particular, there's information about the itemization of the debt, which I'm going to show you on a model of what this letter looks like. There's also some information that has to be included only for certain types of debt, which is what's in red here. There's also required information about consumer protections. So these are things that if you've seen debt collection letters under the FDCPA, you know this is information about how to dispute the debt or request information about the original creditor, and also about assumptions that the debt collector will make about validity. So that you're going to be more familiar with if you've seen these before. But what's different here is that unlike in the past, where the consumer has been told generally that they'll have 30 days to dispute, etc., here they're going to have to calculate the date the validation period ends and provide a specific date using the method specified in the regulations. So I'm going to show you what that looks like too in a minute. For many types of debt, the debt collector, will also have to provide CFPB website information for more information for consumers. And then there's also requirements if the notice is sent electronically about ability to dispute, etc., electronically. And the debt collector also will have to provide that disclosure we talked about, that this is a communication from a debt collector, etc., and that has to be included as well. So all of those things we were talking about, information about the debt, information about your rights, and the disclosure information, that was all required information. This slide has optional disclosures. So these are pieces of information that the debt collector can include. And again, I'm not going to read this, but I just want to point out a few particular things. Disclosures under applicable law, under item 4 here. This is really talking about things like state law disclosures that may be required and can be placed on the back of the letter. Information such as optional statements that people can get their translated copy of the validation notice can be included. Again, this is optional. Debt collectors don't have to make translated copies of the validation information available, but debt collectors can include that. And, you know, again, there are certain disclosures that are sometimes required and are otherwise optional, which are listed in red here. So what I have here in this slide is the top half of a validation letter. So this letter this has the information that we just talked about. So I want to draw your attention to a couple of things that we went over just now. One is we talked about, in terms of the information, some of this new information that is going to be required, the actual itemization of the account. So this final line here has the total amount that they're currently seeking, the total amount that they're claiming is owed. And then that amount is broken down based on amount paid, amount of fees, amount in interest, and that itemization is fees, interest, and amount paid since this particular date. So this date here is called the itemization date, and it's a date that the debt collector chooses based on one of several possible options, including the charge-off date, the last statement date, the last payment date, the judgment date, and the transaction date. So the debt collector chooses this date, and what you'll see in the letter is that it's not going to be clear to the consumer what this date is in many cases. So you may have questions about that because debt collector can choose for themselves which date to use, and another debt collector collecting on the same account at a later point in time might choose a different itemization date. So you might have a different itemization of the same account based on the date that's chosen here. And this is something that, again, isn't disclosed. And if the consumer has questions, you could direct those questions to the debt collector. What you'll also see that we talked about is the specific date that's stated here. Call or write to us by August 28th, 2020 to dispute all or part of this debt. So that is the specific date for the consumer to maximize their rights. But it's important, again, to encourage people to file that dispute at any point. If they do have a dispute on the debt, it's important to raise that with the debt collector as soon as possible. Other things to notice here, there's this website here for the CFPB. There's websites here about requesting more information or disputing in order to file that with the debt collector electronically. And then also here in this case, in this sample, there is information about how to request a copy of the validation notice in Spanish. Down here, this is a notice reminding people about the information on the other side of the notice. So that, again, would be the state disclosures. So we're not done yet with all of the information on the validation notice. There's additional required validation information in the form of consumer response information. And these are dispute prompts, original creditor information prompts, and I'm gonna show you what this looks like here. So this is the bottom half of the model validation notice letter that I showed you before. And you can see it's designed as a tear off portion so that the consumer can actually cut this off and send this back to the debt collector. And the consumer can go and check specific boxes to dispute, to ask for the name and address of the original creditor. In this case, there's been a payment blank included here. It's important to note that no payment is required in order for your consumer to dispute or to request original creditor information. And then also here in this example, they've included a prompt, which is optional, that the consumer could check to get a copy of the validation notice in Spanish. And so this is designed to facilitate responses from the consumer. However, there are other methods for consumers to dispute or request original creditor information, and those include, the standard sending the request or the response by mail, or returning that consumer response form that we talked about. There is also the option of electronically communicating, and what we saw in that letter in the model validation notice was there was actually a website provided by the debt collector to do that. But in general, like with the cease communication requests, if the debt collector accepts electronic communication through a particular email channel or otherwise through another electronic communication method, then the consumer can use that to dispute the debt or request information about the original creditor. And then, of course, delivering in person if that's an option as well. And that is where I'm going to stop and turn things back over to Linda. I look forward to the opportunity to hopefully address some of your questions at the end.
Thank you, April. That was a ton of great information. I hope people are taking notes. Now let's turn to Vicky so that she can discuss what consumers can do when there are more bills than money. Vicky, you have control.
Yes, hi, great. It is great to be here. This particular area is talking about kitchen table economics. And I think, Linda, you set it up beautifully. I can remember my parents, my dad was in the military, my mom owned her own business, and how they would sit around the table and talk about the bills, how to manage the bills, and what to do in terms of ensuring that economically the family had everything they needed, especially if there were any emergencies that were coming up. And so, of course, that all happened around that mythical kitchen table. I wanted to provide some practical solutions about how you can manage debt. I also wanted to share a little bit about Wiser, who we are, what we do, and what we've been doing since 1996. Wiser provides women with basic tools and financial information to really help them take control of their financial lives and to prepare for a secure retirement. We operate with the National Resource Center on Women and Aging with the U.S. Administration on Aging. And our areas include such critical things to consider as Social Security and Medicare, saving and investing, caregiving, divorce, financial fraud and scams, health and long-term care, retirement planning, and widowhood. Why women? Why are women so important when it comes to talking about reducing debt and figuring out how to be able to have solid credit? Women are there. First of all, there are a lot more women than men. And at the age of 65 plus, there are 5.8 million more women than men. Women make up about 67% of the 85 plus population. And this age group is expected to really double, some even triple over the next 3 decades. All of the baby boomers, which I myself am included, we are the baby boomer generation. This group also is the most likely to end up in poverty. And I'll repeat that. This group is the most likely to end up in poverty. Many women who have never been poor end up for the very first times in their lives in old age in poverty. Why you need savings. So short-term savings, even a small amount, can provide a cushion, especially for emergencies. And unfortunately, a lot of women, myself included, before I met up with the folks at Wiser, was actually using my credit card to manage debt, which was a huge no-no. Also, you want to be able to save small amounts of money, have a safe location for your money, and also long-term savings for retirement security. Why Americans need emergency funds? What we have found is many Americans are not prepared for an unexpected expense. 21% of Americans say they have no, that is absolutely no emergency savings. 27% of Americans say they have some emergency savings, but less than 3 months worth. And building up to 6 months for emergencies or minimum expenses is optimal. So don't attach a debit card to the account or be able to easily transfer money out of the account, and use only for a real medical or other emergency, and continue to contribute small amounts even while you're paying down your debt. So part of this process in managing debt is also ensuring that you have the dollars you need for emergency funds in case life happens. And for me, life has happened from everything from a blown water heater to a car emergency. Life happens. And it seems to especially happen right around when you get your either income tax or stimulus money. Always there seems to be that emergency that pops out of nowhere. So jump-starting your emergency savings account, you want to use a part of your tax refund or part of any other windfall of cash to start your emergency fund. I know that that is what I did with the stimulus money that came through. The recommendations that we made to women was that you know that an emergency is going to happen. So why would you spend out all of your tax refund money or stimulus money? You want to set aside a portion of that for emergency funds. If you receive a cash gift or any unexpected cash back, put it right into your emergency saving account. Pretend like it doesn't exist. And then also increase insurance deductibles. Look at auto and homeowners insurance policies. Look for places where you can save money annually on premiums by increasing deductibles and saving that money or paying down debt. I know that one of the places that I looked at in terms of saving money was not only on my homeowner's insurance and my auto insurance, but I also looked at those cable bills and was able to identify ways that I was able to still have premium channels in my home for my daughter, but at the same time be able to reduce some of those high cable fees. And I used that money to help pay down debt and or to go into an emergency fund. Look for promotional ads that will get you lower interest rates on your credit cards or try to consolidate. Just remember that you're likely to need to pay on time habit to qualify. And so there are a lot of promotions out there that will tell you that, zero interest. These are the types of things that you want to look at to see how you can be able to find those additional dollars to either put into an emergency fund or to be able to help pay down debt. And also be aware of the dates when the higher interest rate will pop back if you decide to transfer a balance. So pay real close attention to that, because some of those higher interest rates can put you in a worse situation, because it suddenly pops up to 23.9% interest. Emergency savings accounts help keep a certain amount of cash in an accessible account that you can use only for emergencies. And that doesn't include a pair of Jimmy Choos. That doesn't include going on vacation with your girlfriends to the Bahamas. Those are not true emergencies. We're talking about a job loss, a pay cut, a medical emergency, or unexpected home repairs. We recommend at least 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses, and start small, but build it over time. And then set up a bank or credit union account with automatic deposit from paychecks or from checking accounts, so that you always automatically have something going into that account. It helps you avoid using a credit card or high interest loans, such as a payday loan, to help pay for expenses. I can't tell you how heartbreaking it is to hear from women who often go to a payday loan, usually will put their car, up on a payday loan, and then suddenly find themselves vulnerable where they're not able to pay back the payday loan, and possibly are going to lose their only mode of transportation. It is a catch-22. Women and emergency savings. 47% of women can't afford a $400 emergency expense. I'm going to repeat that again. Nearly 47% of women in the USA have a $400 emergency that could either keep them in their home or keep them in their car or keep them from going further into debt. And they do not have $400 in emergency cash, compared to 35% of men. More than 21% use a credit card for emergency expenses and pay it over time. And women turn to payday loans, bank loans, lines of credit more frequently than men. Women also carry more credit card debt than men. 43% of women compared with 39% of men. And for Latina women, credit card debt is 51%. Show me the money. I've always used to love that movie, Jerry Maguire. So try to break a habit. Try to break a habit. A lot of times, if you look at where additional monies can be found to help pay down credit card debts, you'll often notice it's in behaviors that we picked up that we don't think are extremely expensive behaviors, such as the expensive sodas coming out of the machines. Well, I'm just going to stop by to pick up just a few lottery tickets each week. And those lottery tickets easily turn into $25 to $30 a week in lottery tickets. My nephew's big one for him is Starbucks. We actually challenged him to take a look at how much money you spend in a month at Starbucks, and he was shocked. We challenged him to save that money from Starbucks to make your own coffee, and he was just amazed at how he was able to kickstart and begin to save money. It adds up. If you can't afford something, don't charge it, unless it is a real emergency. And we also encourage you to open an emergency saving account and use this account instead of your credit card. Collect loose change and save your coupon money. These are all practical ways for you to be able to find those extra dollars that you need to start an emergency fund and or to pay down debt. And know what you need to buy before you go to the grocery store. Never shop hungry. Always bring a list with you and stick to your list. I think one of the things that always amazes me is that whenever you shop hungry at the grocery store, it is amazing how you can duplicate items that you probably already have either in the refrigerator or in your pantry. And it is not a solid, sound way to shop. You need to know what you need to buy and you need to comparison shop and you need to ensure that you have a list and that you check through your pantry and that you don't have any duplicates of that item, and you need to shop and buy what you need, not what you want. Keep track of spending. This one was really difficult for me, but I can guarantee that if you write down all of your expenses for 1 month. We said a few weeks, but I say for 1 month. Put them into categories of bills, food, transportation, and then look realistically at how you are spending your dollars. Make a list when shopping and follow it carefully. And also add up all your income, salaries, payments, benefits, divide that by 12 months, subtract the expenses, emergency funds, and start a saving account. And we provide at Wiser a really excellent budget worksheet that really helps take the mystery out of everything. And you're able to keep track of what your expenses are. I say, treat yourself like a corporation. You are a corporation. And every corporation knows where all of their expenditures are going to. You should be able to do that for you and your family. You should be able to keep track of your spending. The key for saving and avoiding debt. Know how you're spending your money, and we've talked about that budget sheet and how invaluable it will be for tracking that. What kind of budgets to use? There are so many different types and formats for budgeting, and they range from, of course, very complicated budgets, but the key is use the one that is working best for you and your family. And one way to track expenses, if it doesn't work, then you want to try another way until you find something that you're comfortable with. And again, I'm gonna give you where you can go for Wiser's budget sheet so that you can get started. You want to get that complete picture of where every penny is going to, where every penny is going to. All sources should factor into how you make ends meet. And when you're looking at expenses, it's crucial to tell the whole truth and nothing but the painful truth. You want to look at each of your expense categories and tally what they are costing you. It should be a financial snapshot of your life. I know for many people, they are just very surprised by how much they've spent in fast food. Just, hey, we're just going to stop for a quick one over here, or we're going to meet with some friends over here. And after a month, the expenses for fast food is just so incredibly high that they are shocked and amazed. And they will tell you, I don't spend that much money. I don't know where my money is going. I don't know why I'm not able to save. But once you have that snapshot of your budget and you're able to see where every single penny is going, it will give you such a clear picture and direction on how you can move forward in the positive. So we want to test drive your budget, track everything you spend for a spending period, ideally for a month, but start with a week if that's easier. And then save receipts and add up the totals at the end of the day or use a tracker. And remember that ATM is not a budget category. You need to track where the cash went. So, what if I don't have enough? This is where you decide what you will and won't do. This is where you start to do the work of budgeting. This is when you begin to get control of your financial life. Don't cut out things that are important to you, or you may not be able to stick to your plan. Compromise is the key. And this is why clear goals are important. They will really help you stick to it. You might have to decide what to pay and what creditors you may have to connect with to talk to about payment options. So, a break in your savings. You don't panic, but regroup. If you can't restart your savings at the same rate, start up with a smaller contribution and increase it later. All roads lead to your financial freedom. All roads. Whether or not you're only able to save $5 or whether or not you're able to save $25. All roads lead to financial freedom. Pledge to give 50% of every future raise, if possible. Want to give that to your emergency funds. And once the kids are out of the house, you also have less expenses, so more opportunity to save. And again, small steps lead to success. I don't know if those shoes represent Jimmy Choo's, but small steps will get you where you need to go. Avoid these delays to save, mistakes that we have all made. Unless you have extra funds and plenty of retirement income savings, don't do this. Pay for children and grandchildren's college. I repeat, pay for children and grandchildren's college. I cannot tell you the number of people I have met who are in their retirement. Their retirement is not secure, and they take critical retirement monies to pay for a grandchild's college education. Children can apply for grants. They can apply for scholarships. They can apply for loans and work part-time to help pay. You do not want to spend your retirement money. There is no scholarship to replace your retirement. There is none. And then on top of it, I've had grandchildren who have disappointed the grandparent by saying, well, I really didn't want to go to that school, and they drop out year number 2 or 3. But the grandparents' retirement funds have been obliterated. Paying for big expenses for adult children. Weddings, not a good use of long-term funds that you will need. And living with you and not having them contribute to the household is another big oops. Take control of debt and credit. So you're going to have to live beneath your means. This is a process that requires sacrifice. An emergency saving fund will help avoid going into debt, and you want to establish a plan to pay off debt. Credit card interest charges and fees, you want to examine them closely. Pay bills before the due date. Pay off more than the minimum payment if possible. And pay off the card with the highest interest rate first. Look for low rate, no annual fee credit cards. And if you can't afford to pay it off right away, don't use your cards. beginning of a brand new year. Check your annual credit report. The free reports can be found at www.freecreditreport.com. And you want to review each monthly credit card bill for unexplained charges or for services you no longer want or need. I can't tell you, not that I'm not a fan of Amazon, but I have found more items that my daughter, especially if she's ordering things, suddenly I find reoccurring Spotify, Amazon items that pop up in my credit that I then have to say, when did this happen? It's a small reoccurring, it looks like a small reoccurring fee of either $3.99 or $9.99. But if you look at that over a year, that is a considerable amount of funds that could go towards taking control of debt. So you definitely want to review those monthly credit card bills for those unexplained charges that seem to pop out of nowhere, especially the reoccurring ones that you don't remember signing up for and you don't even know where it came from. Be sure to take care of that. Contact the credit card company to deal with any errors. And of course, try to avoid using cards if you already have too much debt. Cancel cards in writing. And ask the creditor to allow you to pay more slowly than pay on time. Some of them might be agreeable to it. If you need help or assistance, one of the folks that you can contact is the National Foundation for Credit Counseling. And if your debts start to pile up, deal with the problems before the creditors confront you. Debt collectors, scams, and warning signs. I think that April just gave such a thorough, fantastic job of really describing what some of the new changes in the regulations mean towards protecting you. But still, some other areas that you want to watch out for is you want to ask the caller for their name, their company, their street address, their telephone number. I can't tell you the amount of phone calls that I've received from the so-called IRS, telling me that they have put a lien on my house and that I am going to jail and that they've issued a warrant for me because of a income tax that is owed, which I know I don't owe any income tax. But this scam is so sickening that if you've ever experienced it, you will know what I'm talking about. So check to see if your state's licensed debt collectors. If so, ask for the license number. And you can also ask for a validation notice with the amount of the debt and the name of the creditor. And never, ever, ever give personal or financial information until you know that it is a legitimate collector. The warning signs: if they threaten you, as they've done with me, with criminal charges and arrest, they refuse to provide you with a mailing address or phone number, or they ask for personal financial information. Finding legal representation. So finding a local lawyer referral service, the American Bar Association website, or your state bar association can sometimes help you find a pro bono attorney, especially if you are dealing with some serious debt collections. Be sure the lawyer has experience in consumer law, debt collection defense, or the Fair Debt Collection Practice Act. Consult with a bankruptcy lawyer may be helpful depending upon the amount of the debt. And then determine whether your lawyer has a good, clear understanding of consumer law and how you'll be expected to pay for services by asking questions. how much of your work involves consumer law and representing consumers, and how many cases like mine have you handled before, and do you charge upfront fees? If I can't afford it, can you refer me to an attorney who may not charge an upfront fee? The best way to negotiate a settlement. So learn about the debt, know the name of the creditor, and again, April provided some great resources for being able to negotiate or being able to understand what you should be able to have in terms of the information about that debt. Where did it originate from? The name of the original creditor, if different from the current one. I know a lot of folks are confused because a lot of times your debt could be sold to someone else entirely different. And it's very confusing to people because they're thinking, I have never heard of this creditor before in my life. And it's because your debt has been sold. So make a realistic repayment or settlement proposal. Figure out how much you can afford to pay each month. And again, talk to a lawyer if you're able to about your state's statute of limitations on debt before making a payment on an old debt. You want to determine the total amount that you are willing to pay to settle the debt. And you want to negotiate with the debt collector using your proposed plan. Get the agreement you come to in writing before making a payment. And be cautious of companies that charge money in advance to settle debts for you. Building a solid credit history. So open checking and savings accounts, and you want to establish a credit card in your own name, pay those bills before the due date, and limit the number of inquiries about your credit record. You want to close unused accounts and periodically review your credit reports at www.annualcreditreport.com. When you review those reports, it can give you such a wealth of good information about what is going on. And you're also able to take corrective actions to correct any misinformation that might be included in your credit history that needs to be handled. Financial and debt counseling, finding help. So here are some great folks that you can contact for help concerning financial and debt counseling and information, questions that you may have involving your own particular situation. There's, of course, the National Foundation for Credit Counseling. They are a nonprofit organization that offer financial counseling on debt, credit, student loans, and home ownership. Also, there is Operation Hope. You can be able to get some virtual recovery coaching from them. There is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau at 1-855-411-2372. Again, invaluable information about how you can navigate. There is the Society for Financial Education and Professional Development, and then formally also La Raza, which can also provide information, especially for those where Spanish is critical and they need to have information in Spanish. Savers tax credit. If you have a retirement account at your job, the Savers tax credit is available to eligible individuals who save for retirement. I mention this because it works like a federal match for retirement contributions. Eligible individuals should seriously consider taking advantage of this tax credit. It's for moderate and low income workers, and tax credit for retirement savings works just like a match. It's up to $1,000 for single filers and $2,000 for joint filers. But it is a way for you to have a retirement account. And then finding extra financial help and resources for older adults. There is the Elder Care Locator, which is a nationwide service that connects older adults and their caregivers with local trusted services and programs. And then also there's the Benefits Checkup, which is a program that helps pay for medications, healthcare, food, utilities, and more. And then FINRA Securities Helpline for seniors. Help with health care expenses. This is one of the most major expenses for older adults. Medicare.gov will help you pay for drug coverage, drug cost, and Medicare premiums. The Extra Help program helps low-income seniors pay for prescription drug costs, premiums, coinsurance, and deductibles. And then we have the Senior Health Insurance Assistance Program, SHIP, which provides free counseling to Medicare beneficiaries and their families. They can also assist with applying for Medicare savings programs and filing for the Extra Help application. And Medicare Rights Center as well. Callers living on low or fixed incomes are also screened for additional programs to help pay the cost of Medicare. So try not to spend retirement money. You will just likely pay taxes and a penalty. This is especially true for folks that decide to cash out early before they're eligible on their pensions. Minorities are underrepresented in America's defined contribution system. 25% of defined contribution participants are minorities, whereas 39% of the 2015 US population was minorities. And people will tend to cash out early. And when you cash out, you face challenges preserving small balanced retirement savings. So you really want to be careful and not cash out before you are eligible to do so. The penalties can be extremely high, especially when it comes to paying taxes and other types of penalties. So Wiser's resources are available, of course, at wiserwomen.org. And you'll find there the Wiser Budget Worksheet for getting your budget on track, and also information about turning your short-term savings into long-term savings. So if you're ready to save, let's get started. You'll get information about the emergency savings accounts, the Savers Tax Credit, the Earned Income Tax Credit, types of savings account, debt warning signs, and of course, credit and your credit report, what you need to know. These are the resources that are available. I wish you well in terms of reducing your debt, getting out of debt in 2022. We've given you some practical, logical kitchen solutions for being able to find those extra dollars, to be able to build up those emergency funds, and to come up with creative ways for you to reduce debt in 2022. And with that, I thank you so much. And please like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter.
Thank you, Vicky, and a special thanks to both of our guest speakers. Now, let's move on to Nelson to see if we have any questions. I know we're running a little short, Nelson, but I bet you have a ton of questions.
Yes, let's see if we can get through a few of these quickly. We did have questions during April's discussion about social media contacts from collection agencies or debt collectors. First of all, somebody said, just to be clear, debt collectors can contact you via direct message. And I guess one clarification is this is to demand payment, right? Not just to obtain location information. And then related to that, I'll just go ahead. Related question was, how can the debt collector validate who they are contacting, that they're contacting the right person if they're using social media that way? So those are the questions related to social media.
Yeah, so yes, the rules do allow debt collectors to contact consumers via social media direct message, and to do so for collection purposes, not just to obtain location information from third parties. And I share the concerns about contacting the right people when you're doing so. And so what I would say is that there can be real concerns about third-party disclosures. In particular, some social media platforms would just have you look up the consumer's name in order to contact them by direct message, like Facebook. So individuals with the same name, you can see how a message could quickly go to the wrong consumer with the same name.
Great, well, thank you for answering that. And then when you talked about the time, the 8 communications between 8 a.m. and 9 p.m., does that in the consumer's local time zone? Just a question about time zones with that.
Yes, it's in the consumer's time zone, and there's some details in the regulation which instruct debt collectors who aren't sure where the consumer is located to look at the various clues such as area code, address, and to only contact the consumer at times which would be convenient in all possible locations based on the information they have available.
Oh, great, thank you. And then we have, I'll just read this question. There's a few details here about a situation, but very related here. Said they receive phone calls that are for someone else. They said, we've actually answered, called back and explained they have the wrong number, but it keeps happening. For years, about every 3 to 6 months, a collector calls their number by mistake. How to stop this once and for all, they're asking, as it truly is not our debt and we do not know who it is they are trying to reach.
Yeah, so, the ability to stop a particular type of communication would apply also to individuals, to people that are not the actual consumer. So expressing that, and then if the debt collector continues to contact, you may want to file a complaint with the CFPB using their complaint portal. And you could also potentially contact the Attorney General's office in your state or whoever maintains complaints against debt collectors. And finally, it's possible that there's an actual legal claim under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act against a debt collector who continues to contact after being instructed not to use that type of media.
Great. And then a couple of questions related to relatives. I mean, are relatives ever more on the hook, or can they also get out of these kinds of collection calls? Somebody's asking, can a relative say, stop contacting me? And then also this may be still at the original creditor where a hospital is calling the mom who was placed, presumably from an adult child, the mother was listed as an emergency contact, and now the mother's being told, you better pay us or we're going to send you to collections.
So there's a couple different things going on in that question. Whether or not you can be liable for a debt can be a complicated question, right? Did you co-sign on the debt? Did you agree in some form to be obligated on the debt or sign the contract with this person? There are reasons that you could be liable on a debt such as those. And So that would be a situation by situation question. Now, if you're getting calls from a debt collector about somebody else's debt, they shouldn't be contacting you about to try to collect on someone else's debt. So if they're calling you to obtain location information, now that's permissible, like we talked about, to try to find out how to contact the consumer. But if they're trying to collect from you, you could ask, why is it that you believe that I am obligated on this account? As we talked about before, even a third party can say, stop contacting me. And then if that's not successful, take some of the steps that we mentioned before. And as to the hospital, if the hospital is collecting on its own account, collecting in its own name on a debt owed to itself, then it would not be covered under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, because it would be an original creditor and not a debt collector. So then you'd have to look to restrictions under other laws as to collection practices, such as state laws. So that wouldn't be covered under the FDCPA.
Okay, thank you for that response. Also, going back to one of your earlier slides when you were talking about the calls, the 7 attempts, the 7 days,
Yeah.
in 7 days, you talked about, somebody was just wondering if you could clarify more what you meant by presumption of compliance, rebutting of presumptions, because those are legal terms.
Sure.
So, go ahead.
Yeah. So there are. It is not just a bright line rule. The CFPB basically said sometimes the debt collector can look like it's complying with this number, and actually it's engaging in abusive conduct because it's making these calls in a way that's abusive. For example, if the debt collector called you 7 times directly in a row. So it called you, hung up, called you, hung up, called you, hung up, like that. That could still be a violation, even if it only called you 7 times, because it's engaging in an abusive practice. Similarly, if the court ordered the debt collector to call you immediately about, for some reason, calling an 8th time in that 7-day period, could be deemed not to violate because it would be a permissible purpose. So there's some nuances there, but the idea is it's not a completely bright line, but the debt collector, if it's calling 7 times in 7 days or less, is presumed to be complying, but there's some gray area there.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Another question is, if a debt collector is employed by the company that purchased the debt, are legal actions to collect time-sensitive debt allowed to be used verbally or in writing?
So a debt collector cannot sue on a time-barred debt. A debt collector can, under federal law, a debt collector can collect outside of the court setting. So it can't threaten to sue, but it can still call the consumer or send a letter and try to collect payment. Now, there can be additional state restrictions on the collection of time-barred debt, but we're just talking about the federal prohibitions.
Okay, thank you for that. Someone did ask about the state laws. If there are particular states that are more restrictive, or is there a good resource that people can look to for information about their states?
Yeah, so there are a number of states that have additional protections as to different elements, and so it's going to be a question of which aspect of the rules we talked about they're referring to. But the National Consumer Law Center has a series of manuals about different aspects of consumer law, And the manual that you would want to look at is called Collection Actions, which details specifics as to different state laws, and also Fair Debt Collection, which has an appendix about different state law protections. And people are welcome to email me, and I can connect them with those resources.
Great. And should people also be able to just maybe visit their Attorney General's website for state law on debt collection? Is that where it would be normally?
Yeah, often attorney general's offices have information about state debt collection laws, and it can vary a little bit. So, for example, some states have debt collection licensing agencies, and that's not always the attorney general's office, but that's a good place to start in general.
Okay, great. And then about reporting, credit reporting. Are collectors able to still report after 7 years and 180 days?
So that's controlled by the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is a different federal statute. So nothing in the regulations changes the rules under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So in general, that same period at which most debts would fall off a credit report, that still is the same, and nothing about the regulations we talked about today changes that.
Okay, great. And we did have questions about medical bills. Is there anything in everything that you discussed, it applies to medical debt just the same? Was there anything in the new laws that impacts medical debt in a different way?
So not necessarily in a different way, but I think that things like the call caps being per account and collection is going to be particularly problematic for medical bills, because people frequently have numerous accounts, more than one, often several accounts in collection if they have a single medical bill in collection. So that, I think, is going to be really problematic. I think that the practice of requiring attempts to contact the consumer before credit reporting is hopefully going to be helpful to consumers who did frequently have some of these small medical bills reported to credit reports without any contact from debt collectors.
Okay, thank you so much. I think you're just wrapping up. I do have a couple for Vicky too, but if a new creditor buys the debt, can they, I guess, or a new debt collector, can they use the same contract signed with the original creditor to sue you?
So the contract would be information that about the original arrangement between the parties that is allegedly causing the debt often. And so that contract and the violation of the contract would be the same, and the information isn't always transferred to the new owner of the debt in terms of the actual copy of the contract. But the claim is based on the original violation of that contract, excuse me.
Okay. And I think this is the last one for you, April. Can a company you owe a debt to send the debt to a collection agency without notifying you beforehand?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And Vicky, everybody, we got lots of requests to be able to use the budget sheets, Wiser's budget sheets. Are those available? Can you make them available?
Absolutely, yes. We will make sure that there is an available link for people to be able to access those budget sheets. And they're really, really a great way, as I was sharing, to keep track of your expenses.
Excellent. And then a couple of folks pointed out that for when you said freecreditreport.com, that's the one that's for Experian only. They wanted to just clarify that you probably meant annualcreditreport.com, which is for the 3 bureaus, the one that the FTC also facilitates.
Correct. You are correct.
Okay, excellent. And then somebody was sharing an anecdote here. One second, it was related to the budget. Uh, and it says a lot of people have no savings but lots of debt. If a person is able to tighten the belt a little, and they have a little money left over at the end of the month, what do you think is the best use for that money for these people with regards to debt versus savings? Do you recommend they focus on first getting together an emergency savings, then focus on repaying the debt? Or should they first focus on paying off the debt, then start saving?
I would say ensure that you have an emergency saving. As we shared with you, most individuals, especially 47% of Americans, don't even have $400 in an emergency fund. And usually that $400 is that is the tipping point that can either result in a person, not being able to lose their automobile, because they're not able to pay for an expense to have the car fixed, or it's the tipping point between not having the amount of extra additional money you need for a particular rent payment. So my recommendation is to really first have that emergency fund in place and then look at strategies for reducing your debt.
Thank you, Vicky. And then April, I think one more here related to credit. Once you have paid off a credit card debt to a collector, what is the phrase, sentence you should have them including your receipt to keep from having the debt rear its ugly head again, perhaps with another collector later?
Well, I mean, I think that Vicky actually talked about this, about getting repayment agreements in writing, and certainly getting a receipt from any debt collectors after you've paid off an account. In some cases, people are successful in negotiating what appears on a credit report as well, because remember, just paying off an account doesn't mean that an item will come off a credit report. It should result in the account being reported paid, or paid as agreed, but it's even better if you can get them to take it off the credit report entirely.
Great. Was there anything else, Vicky, on that?
No, I think that was very to the point. Thanks, April.
Excellent. Well, then that's it for the questions, Linda. I think there's really one for you later as soon as I turn it over. A lot of folks are asking for information about the continuing education units. Maybe you can tell them how to get more information. Thanks so much. Back to you, Linda.
Thank you, Nelson. Thanks so much to our guest speakers for hanging in there with us and answering all of the questions. Again, I want to thank our sponsor. The webinar was presented as part of Consumer Action COVID-19 Educational Project with funding from Chase. Now, how to contribute to Consumer Action. You can support us. You can send a check to us. You can pay online by credit card, by PayPal. You can mail a check to us at Consumer Action, Attention Member Giving at 57 Post Street, 6111, San Francisco. And if you enjoyed the webinar as much as you enjoyed a latte at Starbucks, as Vicky talked about, stop the latte for a week and send us the check. And another way that you can support us, as I stated earlier, the webinar is being recorded. You should receive a link to the webinar later than tomorrow afternoon. When you receive that link, please click subscribe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's free, and by subscribing, you will help us continue to bring you these great webinars. Again, a special thanks to our amazing speakers. Please join me in sending them the love. We appreciate you being here. And to our fantastic audience, thanks again for joining us today, and thank you for the work that you do. I look forward to welcoming you back on February 22nd for our webinar on scams in the COVID-19 economy. It's going to be a blast. You don't want to miss it. In the interim, please enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.